The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, joins us live from Brisbane. Thanks so much for your time, Treasurer. We heard Andrew report there that the New South Wales government planning to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in buying back properties in flood zones. Will you go half in that?
Oh, good morning, Kieran. Look, we received, I think, a formal proposal along these lines towards the end of last week, and we'll go through it in the usual considered and cooperative way. The people of northern New South Wales have obviously been through a horrific time when it comes to these natural disasters, and the federal government has been there for them under Anthony Albanese's leadership. So we'll do what we can, subject to the pretty substantial budget constraints that we have. Recognising that the funding of natural disaster relief is one of the big pressures on the budget as we finalise it heading towards next month's handing down of the budget.
We saw the final budget outcome during the week. The Coalition says it's left you in a strong position, and if the budget is to have a worse position when you hand it down in 3 weeks, that's your decision.
Oh, look, I don't think the opposition is awash with credibility when it comes to the budget. When you consider the $1 trillion of debt that they left us, deficits as far as the eye can see, and the combination of economic challenges that's been left to us to deal with. We take responsibility for that. We've got some things going for us, but the backdrop for this budget that I hand down next month will be really 3 things. First of all, a global situation which has deteriorated substantially in the last couple of months. High and rising inflation and interest rates. And thirdly, the pretty substantial budget pressures that are on the budget right now when it comes to funding things like the rising cost of debt, health, NDIS, aged care and defence. So in that final budget outcome, you know, even a fairly substantial and welcome improvement in the prices that we're getting for our exports hasn't gone anywhere near making up for some of those persistent structural pressures in the budget that we've inherited.
Mr Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer, says on the revenue side, it's not just from commodity prices. He says business more generally is in a very healthy state. He says that you've inherited an extremely strong position across a diversified range of improvements, which were all about the V-shaped recovery. You reject that?
Oh, I do. I mean, there hasn't been a less credible, less coherent economic spokesperson from either side of politics in my memory. You know, even with the improvement in the budget, even with those substantial underspends where the former government had overpromised and underdelivered on investment, even with the prices we've been getting for our commodities, which will continue to make a welcome contribution to the budget, even though those prices have come off a bit. Even with all of that, the deficit for last year was $30 billion. We've got deficits as far as the eye can see. We've got $1 trillion in debt, and rising interest rates means that that's getting more and more expensive to service. So that's the backdrop for the budget: the deteriorating global conditions, high and rising inflation and interest rates, and trying to build buffers, not just against this global situation, but being able to fund some of these services that Australians have a legitimate right to expect into the future.
Yeah, and on that, you've said repeatedly that we need a national conversation, and you can see the structural points you're making on NDIS, on defence, on aged care, childcare. Do you have any initial thoughts on where you want that conversation to head?
Well, clearly we've got this combination of spending pressures, those big 5 spending pressures that we keep referring to. Whether it's the unavoidable ones like the rising cost of servicing the $1 trillion in debt, whether it's the desirable investments that we want to make in people's health care or the NDIS or aged care, or in strengthening our national security. These are all important investments as well. And I think that's broadly understood and accepted across the Australian community. The conversation that we need is what is the best combination of spending restraint in other areas, trimming back on wasteful spending. How do we need to change our tax arrangements in areas like multinational taxes? And how do we get the economy growing the right way by investing in skills and cleaner and cheaper energy and childcare and all of these ways that we can grow the economy and strengthen our budget at the same time? That's the national conversation that we're interested in. The October budget will be the beginning of that, but not the end of that. The October budget won't be a fancy budget. It won't be some kind of vanity exercise. It'll be all about difficult decisions in difficult times. We are prepared to take the right and responsible path and not just the path of least resistance. When it comes to trimming spending, when it comes to making sure that our spending is affordable and sustainable and responsible and as targeted as possible so that we can rebuild those buffers against that global turbulence which has gotten worse even in the course of the last month or two.
That cap on tax as a percentage of GDP that the coalition put in place of just under 24%, does that have to go in terms of funding those big items that you referred to?
Oh, look, not on the current numbers before me. As I currently have them, Kieran, we don't expect to hit that cap, but obviously all the numbers will be finalised over the course of the next few weeks. I've said really for some time, including before the election and during the election campaign, I see that cap as largely an abstract thing that was plucked out of the air by our predecessors. Our job is to make sure that we're doing the right and responsible thing when it comes to spending, when it comes to tax, when it comes to growing the economy the right way. And part of that consideration is understanding what's happening around the world. What are the services that Australians got a right to expect us to fund? What are these intensifying structural pressures on the budget? And when you come at it that way, we are prepared to take right and responsible decisions to make sure that we're doing the right thing by people and their economy and the budget.
Have you got thoughts on what those other tax options are? Because fundamentally that's what it comes down to. It's revenue to fund those structural growth areas.
Well, your viewers should expect to see in October, Kieran, the beginnings of our multinational tax policy. We've got discussion papers out there at the moment about implementing our commitments on multinational tax. I think that's the best place to start because I think Australians do recognise that multinationals need to pay a fairer share of tax in the countries where they make their profits, and that's how we fund the services that Australians rely on. And that'll be the beginning of the conversation. But as I said, I think people are up for a broader conversation, whether it's savings, trimming spending, whether it's the best optimal tax arrangements, whether it's how we grow the economy the right way. I think Australians are up for a real conversation about that. My job is to tell them how I see the economy, what they need to know about global developments in particular, and not just what they want to hear. And I think part of that is recognising that our budget is more vulnerable than it should be. We need to make it more resilient. We need to rebuild those buffers against international turbulence. And that's part of the task in October, but the task doesn't finish then.
Does the recent inflation number, I know that it's the first of the monthly series, and for most economists, not a moment too soon for the RBA to have current numbers to be looking at when they make their rates decision. But did that number give you any hope that we might escape the worst of it as we are seeing unfold internationally on the inflation front?
Oh, I think inflation numbers with a 6 in front of them or a 7 in front of them are obviously still incredibly concerning. We expect our inflation challenge to get a bit worse before it gets better, but it will get better. You look around the world and even where in some countries where inflation has come off the peak, it's still extraordinarily high by historical standards. So we're not out of the woods by any measure when it comes to the cost of living. That's why a key task of the budget next month will be providing that cost of living relief in a way that provides an economic dividend and doesn't make the job of the Independent Reserve Bank that much harder.
Well, yeah, and we're seeing a real-life example of how that unfolds, those extraordinary events and immediate shocks off the back of the mini-budget in the UK under the Truss government. What does it tell you about how precarious the international environment is right now?
Well, the global environment is a dangerous and difficult place right now. You know, even in the last month or two, the global situation has deteriorated dramatically. And in many of the major economies that we monitor most closely, the chances of a recession has edged over from possible to probable. And in the United Kingdom, you know, we're reluctant to comment or weigh in on the domestic policies of countries like the UK. But what's happening there, I think, is a cautionary tale about the costs and consequences of getting government policy and central bank policy out of whack, having fiscal and monetary policy working at cross purposes. It is a cautionary tale about what it looks like when you risk getting that wrong. And so that's not irrelevant to us as we put together our own budget to hand down this month.
Does it, just 3 weeks away, does it give you and Katie Gallagher pause for thought to have another look at the way the budget has been put together?
Oh, it's not irrelevant to us, to be upfront with you, Kieran. I think anybody putting budgets together at the moment is looking at what's happening in the UK. As I said, I do consider it a bit of a cautionary tale. If you don't get the cost of living relief right, if you don't rebuild those fiscal buffers against global turbulence, if you don't get those things right, there are costs and consequences. So it's not irrelevant to Katie and I as we finalise the budget to hand down this month. But not just the UK, really right around the world. The situation, as I said, has deteriorated the last month or two in the US, in China, in Europe and in the United Kingdom as well, and no responsible government could ignore that.
On the stage 3 tax cuts, to borrow a phrase, do they remain a core promise?
Oh, as you know, Kieran, we haven't changed our policy on the stage 3 tax cuts for all the reasons that we've talked about on earlier occasions. Our job in the budget more broadly is to make sure that our spending is affordable and responsible and sustainable and as targeted as it can be for all the reasons we've talked about. You know, even in the last month or two, you think about those inflation numbers, you think about what's happening with interest rates, what's happening around the world. And our responsibility is to always try and do the right thing by people in the budget and in the economy to take the right and responsible path and not just the path of least resistance, and that's what people can expect to see.